So good afternoon, everyone. Everyone who's joining us from throughout the country, especially those folks of you in the South. I'm really excited to be able to welcome you all today to the beginning of our webinar series that's going to be, the title of it is Preparing Southern Communities for What's Ahead, right? And it's a series of discussions in HIV intersections and advocacy and conversations that are extremely important to folks in the South to be a part of for CBOs and advocates. So this groundbreaking 6-episode webinar series is designed to prepare community-based organizations and advocates for what is to come in the fight to end HIV in the South. You know, we have heard a lot over the past few months, especially over the past few weeks, about HIV funding. And as funding for HIV prevention, care, and treatment programs come under constant threat, it is more important than ever for communities throughout the South to organize and mobilize in support of one another to end HIV in the South, of course. Now, so this webinar series, which this is part one, this webinar series is going to provide CBOs and advocates with the tools and knowledge they need to engage in effective community-led advocacy efforts, promoting health equity, eliminating health disparities, and expanding access to Medicaid, and how to engage in those fights and how to make those fights sustainable going forward. Our expert panel of speakers will share best practices for engaging with policymakers and stakeholders, building coalitions, and empowering communities impacted by HIV, among all the other different skill sets that they will share. This one specifically, though, this one talks about Tennessee. And it's important for us to start off this webinar series because Tennessee has been a blueprint for how communities can come together to address the issues that impact them, especially when the issues are coming from their government themselves. And so we wanted to be able to highlight this community in how successful they have been in fighting back, and then also in their efforts collectively to create sustainable funding structures going forward. To give you a little background before I hand it off to our moderator today, on January 17th of this year, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee informed HIV-serving organizations in the state of Tennessee that the state would be rejecting federal HIV prevention and surveillance funds and would be returning those funds back to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In the first part of the series, in this episode, we're going to explore the events surrounding the rejection of these funds and the implications that decision may have had on other states in the region. Either have already had those implications or are going to have those kind of that kind of impact in the future. And we want to be able to take a look at how these HIV funds are being used in culture war issues surrounding politics in the region. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to our great moderator today, Eddie Wiley.
Hello, and thank you, Will, and thank you, Zach, for such an important conversation. As someone who has worked in Tennessee for the past, well, since I was a teenager, I'm excited that we get to showcase some of the advocacy work that took place in order to kind of find alternatives to such a disruptive decision into our services. So again, my name is Eddie Wiley, and I'm a consultant with JSI, and super excited to moderate this awesome panel. And before we begin, I want to toss it over to my panelists in order to introduce themselves before I jump into any questions. So first up, I want to hear from Amir. Amir, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Eddie. And, thank you, Will, and the entire Southern AIDS Coalition for having me today. It's such an important conversation, and I'm excited to kind of engage in this conversation from a national capacity because we are not based in the South. My name is Amir Sadeghi. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the policy and advocacy manager at CHLP, and CHLP is a national abolitionist legal and policy organization working to end policies and laws that discriminate against and criminalize people living with HIV. So we as a national organization actually support state-level advocates across the country, including in Tennessee. We're a national partner with the Tennessee HIV Modernization Coalition. We also support and partner with coalitions made up of people living with HIV across the South. Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and it goes more and more from there. So we're a national organization. So I think we fit a little bit differently into this conversation, and I'm actually really excited to uplift the leadership and expertise and wisdom of folks organizing in the South, in Tennessee, about this. And to that end, I'll pass it back to you, Eddie.
Awesome, thank you, and we appreciate the work that you're doing. And now I'll pass it over to Joaquin.
Thanks, Eddie. Hi, everyone. My name is Joaquin Carcaño, he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Southern Health Policy with the Latino Commission on AIDS and our Latinos in the South program. I'm based in North Carolina, but we work in 9 southern states, including Tennessee. When I first joined the commission about 5 years ago, Tennessee was actually one of the first states I got to visit and build relationships with, specifically my now coworker, Jesse Claudio. And so it's really great to be in spaces with Tennessee, to learn from, what's happening and the advocates there, and also find ways to support and contribute, and grateful for this space. Excited to be here.
Awesome, we're excited to have you. And last but certainly not the least is my Tennessee colleague, Krista. Uh-oh, little technical difficulties. It's not letting you unmute. Oh no. Let's see what we can do.
Give me a second. I'm fixing that right now.
Okay. I feel like I could go on and on about Krista. Shall I give you a bio?
Should be good now, Krista. Go ahead.
Okay, there we go. I was like, what did I do? Good afternoon, everyone. I am so glad the Southern AIDS Coalition has asked us all here today for this very important conversation. I am the Director of Outreach and Prevention for Friends for All. I'm in charge of our outreach location, The Haven. We do HIV prevention by testing in the field to normalize testing. At Friends for All, we do treatment, housing, food security, stigma reduction, and free mental health services. It's a layered problem, so it needs a layered solution. And I can't wait for us to get into this conversation. I'm so happy that our national and regional partners are helping us through this effort, and we're going to be okay. But let's talk about it.
Yes, let's talk about it. So let's start with what happened in Tennessee. Will kind of gave us an overview, but I also want to talk about the impact on the community response. So can you provide us an overview of the events surrounding Tennessee's Governor Bill Lee's decision to reject that federal funding, and talk about the impact on HIV-serving organizations in Tennessee?
I guess I'll jump in since I'm here in Memphis.
I was looking at you.
Yes. So first off, it was shocking, right? There was no heads up that this is happening. There was no whispers of something coming down the pipeline. It was just, your contract is over, your funds are up. So it was panic across the state for all organizations trying to fight HIV. People didn't know if they were going to lose their jobs. It's still kind of up in the air for some agencies, right? So not only did staff members not know if they were going to be employed, the community was thinking, why would my government not care about me, right? We had very few answers to give during that time. The best we could do was give them a real promise that we're going to keep supporting you. Do not give up. Do not feel like you are alone. We're in this to help together. So when these funds were rejected, it was met with new priority groups, which were also surprising. One was transmissions from mother to child, one was EMT, and the other was victims of human or sex trafficking. So many of us know an EMT has great access to PEP, even though they're hardly vulnerable to contracting HIV, right? Mother to child transmissions happen so rarely. We're talking 0.01% in the US. And for victims of human sex trafficking, again, that's PEP. Again, that's trying to see what their needs are beyond HIV, but they're not a high vulnerability population. So this complete switch, along with rejection, was just mind-boggling.
Mhm. And some of the impact you mentioned, folks not knowing if they were going to have a job or if their services were going to be cut. So it had a huge impact on the state across the board. Amir, Joaquin, did you all want to highlight some of the impact that you may have seen?
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit, Eddie. We're, as I mentioned in my introduction, we're a national partner with the coalition made up of people living with HIV, people with direct lived experience of criminalization, of HIV criminalization. And when this news originally popped up, I think, some things that Krista mentioned really stood out to me, right? Like panic and disorganization. And I can't help but feel like these were intended and intentional consequences from these kind of organized political attacks against Black and brown, queer and trans folks in the South and in Tennessee in particular. It makes advocates less able to respond to dehumanizing policies and laws and arrests and prosecutions and racial inequities on the ground. So I think that was my sense as well, in conversation and in our partnership with advocates in Tennessee. I think there was a lot of the alarms were raised and there was a lot of panic, and I can tell you though, I'm one dimension of the reaction to this that I just want to put a name to before passing it to Joaquin is that something that I didn't totally love was a lot of national organizations stepped in to speak their piece about what was going on. And that's not always, I think, the right thing and right strategy to go about, right? I mean, I think the most important part of this work of being in a national organization supporting state level advocates is you have to let the folks in the states lead. You have to let people in Tennessee lead. And I think when organizations, based in coastal liberal cities walk in and start making a lot of noise about this, that creates more distraction. And it kind of feeds into the culture war that I think the governor and other right-wing elected officials fully expect, right? They want to provoke. So I think, when just watching national organizations kind of step in and take up a lot of space at first was, I think, unwelcome. It was very, I could tell you from folks in Tennessee found it very unwelcome. And the good news then, I think, is that a lot of the nationals, if from my recollection, did take a step back and let the folks in Tennessee organize and lead a response, work with federal partners on HIV prevention and like the CDC, work with them directly so we could think about this in a more grounded, ground level way. But Joaquin, I'm not sure if you noticed other dynamics as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you naming that. And I definitely have some thoughts on that as well. But one thing I did want to go back to was sort of, like this happened overnight. It was, like Krista said, a shock to everybody. A rejection of funds, especially at this level, was just unprecedented. And so there was a lot of research, a lot of questions being asked, like, where did this come from? How did this even come to pass? And what was found out was that, there was a lot of investigations into the transgender task force at Vanderbilt, into Planned Parenthood funds, and a lot of this whole package of HIV funding, the federal funding to Tennessee, was going to different community groups. And when we think about who's the most impacted by HIV across the board, but especially in the South, are Black folks, are trans folks, are Latinx folks, and thinking about this was a way to sort of cast a wide net and hit as many targets of community people who are very much, I don't know the right word for it, but I keep going back to some of these conservative talking points of like the undesirables. Who do they want to not have a thriving, supportive life? And this was a way to hit targets on many fronts. It was sort of this thread that was unraveled. And so all of this work is connected, and so really think about what does that mean for multiple community groups, people who need access, for multiple sort of who are accessing services from, the HIV orgs, from Planned Parenthood, from the task force. They're affected on multiple levels, and it was a very intentional, measured, calculated step. So I want to think about, like, what is the source of this? It happened overnight in terms of news and notifications for the orgs, but behind the scenes, it was very measured. It was not a rash decision made by these politicians. And so we need to think about that as we go forward in this sort of like fight in these countermeasures. And yes, definitely when it came to sort of the immediate reactions, there was a lot of sort of the national attention, the spotlight, and really thinking about how do orgs with resources and power and influence complement the work and not distract or detract from the work and the power and the opportunity to also invest in local leadership. So I think it was something that happened immediately. Like, people were flying in, people were sort of like trying to lead these conversations. And I think very quickly there was a switch, like Tennessee stood up and said, hey, like, this is us. This is what we know. And this is, these are relationships we can work through and use to our advantage to sort of find answers and continue to advocate. And there was sort of, I think, like a backtracking, like, okay, let's follow this leadership, which I think is a really powerful moment for us to think about, especially as we go forward.
Absolutely. Thank you all for raising those points. Because we did feel the I guess love from the community, but it was great to know that we could step up as advocates in the home state where we live in order to fight for the cause, because it was a challenge. And like you said, Joaquin, it was something that was calculated and something that had been in the works in order to target so many populations that we also prioritize in our work. So my next question will be tossed over to you, Krista. What were some of the initial challenges that we faced as an HIV community in advocating for the policy changes for the decision to reject the funding? And how did we respond to the decision in our area in Memphis?
Well, I will say we organized pretty quickly. The swiftness with which we moved to talk to organizations across the state, we're talking Chattanooga, Knoxville, Johnson City, Nashville, and Memphis. And then the national partners came in to help. And that's what it takes, right? It's, y'all use words like calculated, and if it was organized against us, we organized back, right? And we said, well, where are the most vulnerable parts? And I use that word vulnerable because we are so much in the South, especially Shelby County. We're third in the nation for new HIV diagnoses. That says a lot. And then to have your funding to stop an epidemic like that taken away, it was drastic, and it had people scrambling. And we said, no, we're going to get together, make a plan, see what our options are. So the first thing, Eddie, that we did was organize. We looked at our SSPs, our syringe services programs, and we made sure that the ones we had been supporting could continue to be supported. That's a very interesting population. They're giving their used needles and getting unused needles. And when we test for HIV, we also test for hepatitis C. That's the other part that's so important about this, all the comorbidities that are out there when we're looking at HIV prevention. It can lead to a lot of other infections, and it can lead to a lot of other, how do I say this nicely? Community disparities that happen, and disparities beget disparities, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we see that, we wanted to make sure nobody was left behind. We tried to look at every nook, cranny, option that we had. So that's the first thing that we did, Eddie. And if this were to happen anywhere else, I would encourage all the community leaders to talk to your people on the ground, talk to your decision makers, and you go at this thing as a united front.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was overjoyed to see how the community rallied together, from folks who had not collaborated in years were working with each other, even though there had been miscommunication on some fronts, but to know that we were fighting together meant the world to me. So I was absolutely overjoyed to see that. Now, Amir, did you notice any of the challenges or any of the advocacy on your side from a national perspective?
Not since we're not, we don't provide direct services on the ground or anything like that. I don't think the challenges and consequences and the impact was felt the same way, but I can, just as like a policy wonk here, an abolitionist working to end HIV criminalization, sharing needles, if you're a person living with HIV, is a felony. Engaging in intimate contact without disclosing your status is a felony in Tennessee, right? I mean, sex workers actually face really severe sentence enhancements just because they're living with HIV in Tennessee. And the reason I'm kind of starting my answer with this is because, not only everything that Chris has said, I really support, and I think it's the most important message here, right? I mean, threatening to cut HIV prevention funds will result in an increase in HIV diagnoses. If we're not providing services and PrEP and HIV testing on the ground, where we're especially engaging with the communities who are most at risk for HIV, it's a pretty logical consequence, right? But the thing that I think folks on the criminalization side are really concerned about is an increase in HIV diagnoses will fuel potentially a new dramatic wave of criminalization. People living with HIV are really, really confronted by the criminal legal system as vectors for disease and not as human beings with dignity. And I think that actually, like, human dignity is such an important through line, because it's what connects people providing direct services on the ground, advocates organizing around criminalization and other stigmatizing, dehumanizing policies in Tennessee. The through line that connects us all is that these kinds of funding cuts that were threatened, and that very well could, I imagine, pop up again in the future, not only in Tennessee, but as Krista mentioned, kind of causing a ripple effect in other states. The most important thing I think to remember is that what we're seeing are the broader context of these cuts fit into this insurrection of violence, of queerphobic and transphobic and anti-Black violence, and a reckless disregard for the human dignity of people living with HIV and people affected by HIV. So I think it's important to keep that in mind too, that these funding cuts, whether, I know the next episode in this series is going to be about kind of the more congressional funding scenario, which is a pretty scary one. And so whether we're talking about funding cuts there or at the state level, I think it's kind of critical to keep in mind that this will cause a wave of criminalization. This will increase and fuel the criminalization of people living with HIV indirectly. And the people who are most in need of the services and support in Tennessee are the same exact people who are facing HIV arrests and prosecutions. I mean, Black women specifically in Tennessee are uniquely affected, and Black Tennesseans living with HIV in general. So, which I don't imagine is a surprise to anyone at this meeting. So, those are some of the effects that I think we're monitoring and are most concerned about.
Yeah, thank you. Those effects can have such a damaging impact on everything that we do in the fight to end the epidemic. So now I want to toss it to you, Joaquin. What were some of your observations on the challenges and the response?
Yeah, definitely. Again, to comment on what Krista shared, was that it was swift. Like, there was really like an immediate, okay, what do we need to do? What do we need to plan? They were organizing buses. There was advocacy days. There was lobbying days. It was immediate. It was a complete shift of like, okay, when you gather these people, we're going to get them there. We're going to coordinate with these other groups. That was a really incredible thing to witness. And I was in Tennessee for some of those advocacy days with my colleague who's in Memphis, and got to witness this for myself, which was a really powerful moment. And I think something I learned in talking with folks there was some of these challenges of, we know that direct services don't stop, and things are going to continue. Like Krista was saying, we found ways to pull funding to find a way that like services are not going to pause, are not going to stop. Community was scared. How do we make sure to fill in those gaps while we continue to work on this? The thing is, at the same time, these groups are organizing to also respond to this. And we're talking about staffers who are already under-resourced, burdened, stretched thin, to have to take on this whole other role in their job. And a lot of this was new for some folks who had not experienced these sort of advocacy days, these lobbying days, who were nervous about speaking about their own personal experiences, and thinking about, I want to share this part because I think this is an opportunity for how we build going forward, is using some of these resources and power of these national or regional groups, of the policy expertise, of the research expertise, to support and supplement some of the work that the groups are doing on the ground, to say, continue focusing on your work and what you know best. And we can provide some of these sort of like policy details that get very messy and clunky and can easily make people feel like this is not a space for me, but it's a space because these are your experiences. This is going to impact your life going forward. So it is your space. You own this space. So what can we do as bigger communities of investing in that sort of empowerment for people to say, I'm not just going to respond to this issue, but I'm going to respond to all of these issues going forward. I have a space to be at these lobby days, or space to talk to my legislature and be this vocal advocate. So I think that was a challenge of having to shift your complete workday and your work responsibilities of direct services, and having to do these crash courses on policy and what does it mean. And you're hearing all these different things around budgets and deadlines and sessions, and it's a completely new world for some folks. And so really thinking about how to bridge some of that. And it's a heavy burden for some orgs to take on, because they already got a full workload and then some. So I think that was some of the initial stuff. The response was still incredible. I mean, they took it on without so much as like a breather sometimes, like, okay, I'm just jumping in full force. But I think those are some of the spaces where we can really think about more cross collaboration that is sort of an ongoing sort of intentional part of our work, rather than a crisis response as well.
Yes, so I heard collaborating, empowering, organizing. Those are some of the strategies that were set forth in the fight. So maybe, Krista, can you start us off with some of the other successful advocacy strategies that were put together to fight the funding rejection, and talk to me about how can some of those strategies be applied in other regions that may be facing or may face similar challenges?
Joaquin hit the nail on the head. We did a day on the Hill in Nashville to talk to our legislators, and that was amazing just to see. I don't usually look at the legislative side. I know what's going on, but I don't actually talk directly to them. So a day that's organized where you can talk to the people making and voting on the laws is so important. The very critical factor in this, we talked about the bottom line on the day on the Hill. When you're talking to these decision makers, tell them how it hits in the pocket, right? They care about money. So if you want to take somebody off Prep and Pep, and Prep and Pep is what, $100? You know what I mean? Like, and then they're not on Prep and they contract HIV, and now they have diabetes, and now they have other complications, and now they're in the ER more, and now they don't have insurance. Look at how much money it's costing. Like, even money wise, it's very confusing. So I would encourage other areas to look at the cost benefit analysis of these decisions and show them where they really feel it, which I think is where the money is. A lot of politicians do care about people. You can go for the heartstrings, but I am personally going to encourage you to show them how much it costs to not prevent HIV.
A dollar makes a lot of folks holler. Okay, so absolutely a great strategy when fighting with, or not fighting, when discussing these types of causes with politicians. Absolutely is discussing the bottom line and how it impacts the overall cost for the state. So what say you, Amir? Any strategies that you saw that folks can take on?
Well, I think Joaquin and Krista are the real experts here, but something that I think just to add to these points, I think building the leadership, and Joaquin was talking about this, right? Like it is not easy talking about budgets and legislative decisions and the whole, all these processes, all of a sudden people are talking about Robert's Rules of Order and you're like, what? I mean, so that's why, I see some folks attending here, like from PWN, for example, like PWN USA, Zero Network. These important organizations are great resources to turn to about building leadership at the ground level of people living with HIV to learn the advocacy strategies and engage in this process directly. So I think those two resources are really important ones. And I know, for example, especially PWN have chapters in states. So if you're a person living with HIV in some state, there might be actually already an organized chapter that you can connect with. But the other thing, just my own 2 cents, again, awkwardly entering this space from a national perspective, though I'm a Southerner by birth. I'm from Florida, and Florida increasingly, a state going in a very violent fascist direction. But, I think an important strategy for us organizing to end HIV criminalization, if you're organizing around HIV funding and HIV prevention services, racial equity, it's cross-movement organizing. I think we need to be better about building our movement, right? I mean, and I think movement building isn't about finding your tribe, it's about growing your tribe. And I do think there are a lot of lessons that we have yet to kind of fully apply and appreciate and enliven in our movements, in the HIV anti-criminalization movement specifically. And I do think cross-movement organizing, right? Because as Krista and Joaquin have mentioned, HIV, first of all, HIV affects everybody, regardless of your status. If you're, seropositive, seronegative, HIV affects you. HIV affects communities, it affects families, it affects children. If it touches literally all of us. And I think from that starting point, and especially then the next step in building relationships is recognizing that that Black and brown people and queer and trans folks, especially I think, Black people in the South, we have to be better about building connections and relationships between the HIV movement and folks responding to anti-Blackness and in the South. I think there has to be a stronger connection there, and it's something that we at CHLP and others attending today, I know are investing in as a strategy and as a way to build our movement. So we have to really, I think, center and uplift Black communities in the South in these struggles. That is a really important part of this.
I love that. How you said it's growing your tribe. So absolutely love that. Now, Joaquin, I know you mentioned some of the strategies. Are there anything else that you observed?
Yeah, I mean, I agree on all points. Also, just to second, PWN, the Well Project, Zero Project. I mean, incredible resources I turn to sort of learn about, what I need to know, in the movement, and hear from people directly impacted as well, and share those resources out. So I think there's powerful work being done there, very valuable, that's being shared across our field. And I think one thing that's always on my mind is that this sort of cross movement building is that I think within our movement, I feel like we're very well versed on how housing insecurity, food insecurity, how job instability affects people living with HIV. But outside of our movement, do like some of the housing orgs think about HIV? Are the food banks, the food insecure, movement places thinking about people living with HIV? And I think we're often building that within ourselves, but people aren't inviting us out. And I'm wondering like what that looks like or how to sort of help bridge that. Because we have so much to offer each other. I think our movement is so powerful. I think our movement is often at the forefront of advocacy and direct action and being vocal and bold and unapologetic. And so how can that sort of be brought into other spaces? Because they will benefit from what we know and the lessons we've learned. And I think that can also be a very mutual relationship. The thing about those cross movement building, and also we still have lots of ways to go and growth to do within our movement as well. Thinking about anti-Blackness, ongoing transphobia within our movement as well. Just sort of like the legacy of harm sometimes within our movement. So what do we do to address all of these things and really grow? And I think also always youth, I think because of when there was like the advocacy day in Tennessee, there was also some of the anti-trans bills going on. So there was a lot of like families there and young trans folks, and people are sort of like mingling and learning from each other. And I think those are huge, huge points that like we can continue to build off of, that we are sort of showing up these days, we're impacted, we're sharing resources, and how do we continue to build from there? And I think the other point is really the grassroots sort of groups, direct service orgs, and the policy pieces that often like they slowly kind of like move away from each other over time, unfortunately, and we'll come back together when it's necessary. But I think what do we do to sort of keep in each other's orbit more intentionally and have these really genuine conversations and build from there? And that so I think the direct service orgs is where a lot of the transformation happens. I mean, that's where the direct line to people, the forefront of people. And as we move into sort of the advocacy and policy gets more and more disconnected from community sometimes. So I think being able to sort of bring each other back and keeping each other's realm is really necessary and powerful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Having that just hand on the community, like you mentioned, the direct service orgs having that direct line to the community, and having other organizations or entities kind of feedback into that orbit of being close and having community input is really important. So let's talk about some of the implications of the Tennessee decision on the rest of the South. So considering that we have a unique political landscape and culture war issues, how might other state legislators in the region view federal HIV funds in light of the decision in Tennessee?
Could you clarify your question, Eddie? Because when I hear culture war, let me be careful about this. I'm gonna use an analogy first, right? Here's the issue. There's red ants and black ants in a jar, and then someone shakes the jar. And now the red ants and the black ants are now mad at each other instead of being mad at the person that shook the jar. And I think we really need to think about what that means when we're strategizing on how to get our needs met. I'm just talking about needs, right? There are wants. We don't want to just survive. We want to thrive. And so we need to be looking at those legislatures who understand that, who don't want to just give us enough to get by, but want us to have a thriving community, right? And I'm going to leave it at that.
Love it. I love that analogy. Let's see. Did you say clarification? Yeah, that was an answer. Partial, okay.
Well, maybe I don't need the clarification after all. I said what I said. Said it.
And mic drop, okay? Now, Amir, let's talk about some of the other state legislators and how they view the funding as well.
Yeah, I think, I think that I actually really liked Krista's analogy too. And, I mean, lots of states in the South, I think, are concerned about how their governments and lawmakers might feel emboldened by what happened earlier this year in Tennessee. So I do think that is a very that is a real dynamic here that I think people are concerned about. And I also think that if we aren't as strategic at I think something Krista mentioned about like the dollars and cents of this are important to this too, right? Because I think communicating the cost of not preventing HIV in a community to maybe lawmakers on the other side of the aisle, that might be an effective talking point, especially in some of these states with the political context that we're working with. But, I have to be honest that I think a part of me recognizes that some of these forces that we are in struggle with don't really give a damn about an increase in cost, because the whole point is to strip marginalized people of their humanity and their dignity. And I do think there are people in power shaking the jar, right? There are people in power who don't really care. And that's what I think speaks to the purpose and the importance of like cross-movement organizing here and kind of cross-movement solidarity. Because I think what we're really seeing is a war against human dignity of marginalized people, especially queer and trans people. It's the statistic has been talked about a lot about this year, over 400 pieces of legislation, anti-trans legislation, introduced in state legislatures. This, I think, there's a sobering, lesson and kind of cautionary tale in this political moment that we're in. And it's kind of I'll use an analogy too. It's kind of like the Rip Van Winkle cautionary tale. Rip Van Winkle, who accidentally slept through the American Revolution, right? And the thing I think I want to communicate, especially if there are people connected to services, working in the public health level, maybe more specifically in health departments, is be careful not to sleep through this revolution. We need allyship. We need cross-movement solidarity. And I think turning your head to the politicized and deeply racist and queer-phobic nature of these attacks, because you have your constraints, because you maybe work at a health department, and I think we can't hide right now. This is very real, violent, uprising happening, and people living with HIV and marginalized Black and brown people are at the crosshairs of this. So I do think the cautionary tale is not to sleep through this, and we have to, I think, we have to name what's actually happening and the nature of these attacks, the nature of stripping people of their human dignity. I think we if we don't name it and we don't start from that point, how can we possibly hope of being organized together to fight back?
Yes, it's important to put a name to it. That's a great point. So, Joaquin, what about you?
Yeah, I love that analogy too, Krista. So I might use that in the future if that's okay with you. Full credit to you. I'm also a very visual person, so when I heard this question, I was thinking of like when this came out, this news came out. I think the worry at our end was that other states would fall in line. It's like this, like the visual in my mind is like a cat, like there's a laser pointer and it's like, oh, a new target, it's ready to pounce. And I think that's what was sort of in our minds as things went on. And we started to hear whispers from other states of people coming to us and saying, we haven't heard this from our health department. We are having trouble getting in contact with anybody. Do you know who we could talk to? Or do you know what's going on? Do you have any insight? Or this health department, or, hasn't hired this position that's really vital to our work in so long. This can't be a coincidence. Do you know what's happening? And really thinking about other sort of calculated steps places are taking and states are taking in similar fashion, and worrying that, should this succeed in Tennessee, that other states would quickly fall in line. And we started to get these worries and concerns. And I think they were bound in like legitimacy that like, as we've seen also in sort of the trans and also abortion work, and that's where I've done a good chunk of my own advocacy, is that it's a very similar playbook. One state will propose something, it's successful, another state will fall in line, or if it's not successful, they sort of repackage it, fix some of those gaps or pieces that maybe came under scrutiny, repackage it in another state, and then they'll try it, and they use the same playbook. It's similar sort of puppet masters behind the scenes. And I don't think this is any different. We know a lot of these people crosstalk, a lot of the sort of lobbyists on their side are across these borders. Our work and our lives may be centered in our state, but our lives are also transient, and their sort of playbook is transient to attack our community across the board. And so we see this playbook happening. We see the same steps. And so I think that was a big worry. What are we going to see next? What are sort of the dominoes that are falling? So I think it's important to be concerned, and to name things like you said, Amir, to be honest about what is happening. Let's not sugarcoat it. I mean, I think there's a certain balance of like fear and honesty we have to weigh, because you don't want to terrify people, and there can be extreme measures, but we also have to be honest to also sort of put a fire under people, make people see the reality of like, yes, you can't sleep. This is serious. We need to step in. Now is not the time to be like, oh, it'll be fine, because we've seen that start to fall. We've seen, the Supreme Court and other systems start to, be pushed in another direction. And so sometimes we need that fire and that reality, or that reality check. So I think that's what our concern is. We haven't sort of seen that play out, but I think we have to pay very close attention to what's happening at sort of the state level and other states as well, and listen to those advocates too. I know like Texas Strike Force, an incredible policy machine, and they are like on it. And so really thinking about like, are people tapped into that? What is that like? What are they hearing? And again, how can people support their work, use those lessons across the region, and continue to build out that movement that's not sort of state specific, but regional as well.
Absolutely. You mentioned can't sleep doing this. Like Rihanna said, lift me up, wake up. So we have to be able to fight against it in other parts of the state, which leads to my last question. So let's talk about some of the lessons learned or the warnings that policymakers and advocates from other states can draw on from the Tennessee experience, and how can they protect and prioritize their prevention funding in their own regions?
That's so important. A part of me like, don't tell them the secrets joke. But first thing that I noticed, and I want to echo Amir and Joaquin on this, name it, right? The bigger part that I see is a spirit of fear. And I don't want that in my community as we go into this fight, right? And Eddie, you corrected yourself earlier, like not fight, organize. No, it's a fight. We're having to like roll up our sleeves and get done what needs to get done so that we can be more than all right. So when I see this spirit of fear at different rallies, like, why did this happen? They don't care about us. That's not as helpful as it is to knowing your options. So know your options. Confusion is of the devil, right? Whether you believe it or not, it's a mess. So we don't need confusion. We need to know what's going on, to know what helps us, and to know what zip codes are needing to be looked at first. And results-driven data is important. Get your data. Tennessee, Texas, Florida, as we see this going around, and I've said it before, I don't want this to be the blueprint for other parts of the country. Know what your options are, know what your funding options are, know what you can do if it comes to your area. And when you talk to your community, you let them know we're not going at this from a spirit of fear. We're going at this knowing what our tools are and what our options are, and we have options. Don't let them make you feel like you don't have options or like you're stuck. That is the difference between surviving and thriving. And I'll end with that.
That fear, yes. Let's not even fear. Let's continue to fight. So yes, Amir, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so moved by, it's hard to follow that. I'm really moved by Krista's comments. And I think just to add to that, I like an important, like maybe warning or or like a lesson learned? Well, first of all, as Krista mentioned, like start the work yesterday. Like I hope folks are getting had already gotten started. Because these announcements, the announcement happened in January. Then I know that there were some, mitigation efforts, and in response to this incredible organizing that happened at the ground level. But the future's uncertain, and I think for other states, the lesson is get started now, and really listen to folks, I think, like Krista, who knows a lot more about what to be aware of in terms of like funding streams in your state. But to the spirit of Krista's comments, like, let's not start on a defensive footing. I think too much of the HIV movement, too much of our movements in queer spaces sometimes start from like this defensive place, because we are literally defending ourselves in the midst of a fight, right? It is a fight. It's something that we will win or lose. And I think kind of thinking about it in simple terms like that is helpful to me, right? I mean, because organizing and movement building isn't about buzzwords and politically chic language. It's about winning shit. And we have to win shit, and have to win this fight. And we have to start from a proactive position, not a defensive one, despite the fact that folks in our communities are targeted and are subject to so much violence interpersonally and via the state. So I think don't start from a defensive position. And compromise, I get it, it's a part of this struggle. But in order for our movement to work, we can't compromise on our values and principles that motivate us to do this work, to fight for the human dignity of people affected by HIV and living with HIV. We can't compromise on that. And the most important values and principles here are the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and meaningfully centering the people most affected. Because I think something we haven't named yet is I think it's probably clear that in terms of threatening cuts to PrEP and PEP and syringe services and HIV testing and condoms are sex workers. Sex workers are going to face really significant consequences in these kinds of HIV prevention cuts. And sex workers are also the most affected and most targeted and criminalized because of their health status. And I think, we really have to be centering and building solidarity with sex workers living with HIV, sex workers embroiled in these struggles for their dignity and rights. So that's an important part of this too. I think we really have to think of this proactively, not defensively, and we have to center the people most affected by these decisions.
Mm-hmm. I love that it's bigger than inclusion is absolutely having folks involved that normally a lot of folks just don't engage with them. And that's an unfortunate part, because when you talk about dignity, we want dignity for all. So yes, absolutely. Now, what about you, Joaquin?
Yeah, it's hard to follow both of y'all. I think y'all covered so much. So like my brain's kind of going, but one of the things that the HIV movement has done so well is that we're bold, we're vocal, and also sort of fly under the radar. And some of it is to protect our people and to protect the funding that support our people. And there have been whispers that, can't always let people know where this funding goes or it will get cut. I think that's been sort of like an underlying or unconscious thought in our mind, is if they knew, we would lose it. And I think we've sort of reached that point. So what does that mean going forward? Is sort of continue to be big and bold and grow, bring more people in, make people feel like they belong in all of these spaces. Like you said, Amir, sex workers have, belong in this space, aren't always, feel comfortable, can be their full selves. and for trans folks, for Black folks, you know, like we bring so much complexity of our lives into these spaces, and we often have to sort of like package them really nicely to sit around a conference table to discuss these things. But what does it mean to like build that out and really think about who's missing, who's vocal, whose voice is not being uplifted, and also just how to continue to bridge the gap between our community orgs and the policy advocacy piece. How do we make sure community folks have a big, important, valuable role in the advocacy and policy piece, that they feel that they belong there, that they have something to say, and that they're going to be listened to? And I think making sure that our policy and advocacy arms of our orgs reflect our community. I think there's often that disconnect, you know, when it comes to class, education, race, it can go on, making sure that that's not the case. How do we continue to sort of like realign ourselves with our people and bridge those gaps?
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of the phrase we always use, meet people where they are, but it's more than that as well. It's making the space where people can feel safe, a space for learning, a space for giving us feedback as well. So thank you for making that point, Joaquin. And I want to thank Joaquin, Krista, and Amir for such an awesome just insight into what's happening in Tennessee, how it can affect other parts of the South and a part of the country. Now we only have 3 minutes left, but I did want to open it up for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the community or from the audience. If you do have a question, you can raise your hand, you can type it in the chat for our awesome panelists. And if Joaquin, Krista, or Amir, if you had any parting words of wisdom or anything, feel free to pop those in as well. Any shout outs, anything coming up? Okay, Denise, I see your hand.
Hi, my name is Denise Smith, and I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. And what I have noticed, and I'm glad that I did get on this call, because there's a trend in the South. I'm not from the South, but I'm living in the South now, and I noticed there's a trend. And when there's an action that's being taken place against a particular group of people, it has a way of trickling down the pipeline. And my question is this here. With advocacy, because I noticed there's 2 different types of advocacy, which I never understood. If we're advocating for people living with HIV, shouldn't we do it as a whole? Because I see it's like 2 separate things. It's like medical, and now it's medical they have, and then it's the criminalization. How would that look as one component?
I'll try to answer this very quickly. We actually try to do that work here at Friends for All. And if other organizations could do it, if they need help with capacity, and you see other organizations do it, ask, how can I help you do this? Some of the issues we have is competition sometimes. In the South, I'll just be honest. I mean, it's all over the nation, but I just can see it from my end. There's enough HIV testing to go around. So there's a big event. Everybody needs to share testing. Don't try to compete, because you got to get your grant numbers, right? If there's sex workers and you need to be involved in these organizations like the Tennessee HIV Modernization Coalition, you work with them. I said this at the very beginning, Denise. This is a sandwich problem that needs a sandwich solution. So it should all work in tandem. And so when we do advocacy and we get people on the bus, we bring everybody from the community that we possibly can. Because these are real people being impacted by these legislative moves. And they need to see who they are impacting and hear from them. So if you want to talk later offline, I have some more ideas about that, and I'm happy to share.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes, evangelist right there. That's what we're gonna call you. Awesome. Well, we're at the top of the hour. And again, I want to thank the awesome panelists. I want to thank Will and the SAC team. And thank you all for joining us for the first of the series, first part of the series. You all have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Will and Eddie, and you know, Joaquin and Krista. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Pleasure.
Everybody for joining. I'm sorry, Krista, go ahead.
No, it says pleasure being here.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. The recording today will be available by SAC by the end of the day. Follow us on our socials, or join our newsletter, become members. we'll be continuing this conversation by bringing up the federal HIV funding dynamic in our next webinar episode, and that's going to be happening in just a few weeks. So please stay tuned, and we'll be sharing the dates and times in the coming days. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.